Let's get started. Story number 1.
The first snow of the season had blanketed the countryside in a pristine layer of white, and the air carried that biting chill unique to midwinter. Sarah had always loved the small cabin her family owned in the woods, a secluded getaway they used every holiday season. This year, however, was different. Her parents were stuck in the city due to a blizzard, and her younger brother had decided to stay with a friend. Sarah, now 24 and eager for some solitude, volunteered to go up alone and spend a quiet weekend away from the noise of her urban life. The drive was uneventful but slow, the snow piling up on the narrow road that wound through the forest. By the time Sarah arrived, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting the woods in an eerie twilight. She parked the car, grabbed her bags, and trudged through the snow toward the cabin. The wind whistled softly through the trees, and the crunch of her boots against the frozen ground was the only sound for miles. The cabin was exactly as she remembered, a quaint two-story structure with a steep roof and a chimney that was already puffing out smoke thanks to the automated fireplace her dad had installed years ago. Inside, it was warm and inviting. The living room was cozy, with a large, worn couch and a small Christmas tree her mother had put up weeks ago. Sarah set her bags down and made herself a cup of tea, settling in with a book as the wind howled outside. Hours passed and the storm intensified. The wind slammed against the windows and the old wooden beams of the cabin groaned under the pressure. Sarah wasn't concerned. She had spent countless winters here and the cabin had always held up. But as the night wore on, a strange unease began to creep over her. It started with the sound. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but it was different, softer, more deliberate. A faint tapping noise echoed from the direction of the front door. She looked up from her book, her brow furrowing. She set the book aside and walked to the door, her slippers scuffing against the hardwood floor. She peeked through the peephole. Nothing. The porch was empty, the snow falling in thick, heavy flakes that obscured everything beyond the steps. Dismissing it as a branch or some other debris knocked loose by the wind, she returned to the couch. The tapping came again, louder this time. It was followed by a faint scratching sound, like nails against wood. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She walked back to the door, this time turning on the porch light before opening it a crack. The cold hit her immediately, and the snow swirled in the glow of the light. But there was nothing there. No footprints, no sign that anyone or anything had been near the door. Shutting the door firmly, she locked it and double-checked the windows before returning to the living room. She tried to focus on her book, but her concentration was broken by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the snow outside. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She grabbed her phone and turned off the lights, plunging the room into darkness except for the faint glow of the fireplace. Creeping toward the window, she peeked through the curtains. The snow outside was unbroken, undisturbed. There was no one there. But the sound of footsteps continued, now circling the cabin, moving from one side to the other. Sarah's hands trembled as she grabbed the fire poker from the hearth and backed away from the window. Her phone had no signal, expected, given the storm, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The footsteps stopped suddenly, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. Then, from upstairs, she heard it. A soft creak, as though someone had stepped on the old wooden floorboards. Sarah's blood turned cold. She was certain she had locked all the doors and windows. Her chest tightened as she stood frozen, staring at the staircase. The creaking continued, slow and deliberate, moving toward the edge of the upstairs landing. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. Gripping the fire poker tightly, Sarah summoned her courage and called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" The creaking stopped. Her voice echoed hollowly through the cabin, swallowed by the storm outside. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind. Then, a new sound reached her ears, a faint whisper, barely audible, like someone murmuring her name. Sarah. She dropped the fire poker, her heart hammering. It had come from upstairs. The rational part of her mind told her to grab her keys and run, but her legs felt like lead. She forced herself to move, picking up her phone and flashlight as she edged toward the staircase. She climbed the stairs slowly, the old wood groaning beneath her weight. At the top, the hallway stretched out before her, the doors to the bedrooms and bathrooms standing slightly ajar. The air was colder up here, almost unbearably so, and her breath came out in visible puffs. The whisper came again, this time from the master bedroom. Sarah. The door was half open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. She reached out with a trembling hand, pushing it open fully. The room was empty, but the window was wide open, snow blowing in and coating the floor. She knew for certain she hadn't opened it. As she stepped into the room, her flashlight flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness, and the whispering grew louder, surrounding her. It was no longer just her name. It was a chorus of voices, overlapping and unintelligible, growing more frantic with each passing second. Panicked, Sarah turned and ran, slamming the door behind her. She bolted down the stairs and grabbed her coat and keys, throwing open the front door and stepping out into the blizzard. The snow was nearly knee-deep, and the wind stung her face as she stumbled toward her car. She fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking so badly she could barely get the door open. Once inside, she locked the doors and started the engine, the headlights cutting through the swirling snow. She glanced back at the cabin, half expecting to see someone, or something, in the window. But there was nothing. As she reversed down the driveway, her headlights caught movement in the woods. A shadow, tall and humanoid, stood just beyond the tree line. Its head tilted as if watching her. Sarah's breath hitched, and she floored the gas, the car skidding slightly as she sped down the road. She didn't stop driving until she reached the main highway where the storm had begun to let up. Pulling into a gas station, she sat in the car, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. She tried to make sense of what had happened, but no explanation came to mind. When her parents returned to the cabin days later, they found it as they had left it, except for the master bedroom. The window was still open, and the snow inside had melted into a puddle on the floor. They dismissed Sarah's story as stress or an overactive imagination, but she knew what she had experienced. Something had been there that night, something that didn't belong, and it had whispered her name. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The wind cut sharply through the air, carrying the kind of chill that settled deep in the bones. In the heart of a dense forest stood a small, weathered cabin, barely visible beneath a thick blanket of snow. The cabin belonged to Hannah's late grandfather, who had built it as a hunting lodge years before she was born. Since his passing, it had been used only sparingly, but when Hannah needed a break from her hectic city life, it seemed like the perfect place to unwind. Hannah arrived just before sunset, her SUV struggling to navigate the unplowed road leading to the property. The cabin looked the same as she remembered, small but sturdy, with smoke curling lazily from the chimney thanks to the automatic heating system. She unloaded her supplies and stepped inside, the wooden floors creaking beneath her boots. It was cozy enough, though the isolation was palpable. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and her phone barely had a signal. That didn't bother her, though. She was looking forward to a weekend of solitude. After unpacking her bags, she started a fire in the old stone fireplace and curled up with a blanket and a book, the storm outside growing more intense. By the time night fell, the cabin was surrounded by darkness, so complete it felt oppressive. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the shutters and making the whole structure groan. Hannah wasn't easily spooked, but the vast emptiness of the forest combined with the storm made her uneasy. She reassured herself that the cabin had stood for decades through far worse conditions. Around midnight, she decided to head to bed. The small bedroom was at the back of the cabin, its single window frosted over from the cold. As she slipped beneath the heavy quilt, she heard it. A faint knock, barely audible over the sound of the wind. She sat up, listening intently. There it was again, 3 deliberate taps coming from the front door. Her stomach tightened. Who would be out here in the middle of a blizzard? She grabbed her flashlight and cautiously made her way to the door. Peering through the peephole, she saw nothing but swirling snow. Another knock came, louder this time, and her breath caught in her throat. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaky. No answer. Summoning her courage, she unlocked the door and cracked it open. The icy wind rushed in, stinging her face. She shone her flashlight across the porch and into the snow-covered yard. Nothing. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. She shut the door quickly, bolting it this time, and tried to calm her racing heart. It must have been the wind, she told herself. She returned to bed but struggled to fall asleep. The cabin's usual creaks and groans seemed louder, more deliberate, as though someone or something was moving just out of sight. Around 2 a.m., she heard it again. This time, it wasn't a knock, but the sound of footsteps crunching through the snow outside her window. Hannah froze, her breath hitching. The window was frosted, but she could see faint shadows moving just beyond the glass. Grabbing her phone, she turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the window. The light reflected back at her, revealing nothing but frost and darkness. Still, the footsteps continued, slow and methodical, circling the cabin. She dialed 911, but her phone couldn't connect. The storm had knocked out what little signal she had. Panic began to set in as the footsteps stopped, replaced by a soft scratching sound at the front door. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more insistent, as if someone was trying to claw their way inside. She grabbed a kitchen knife and stood frozen in the living room, her back to the fireplace. The scratching stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Then, from above, she heard the floorboards creak. Her blood ran cold. The attic. Hannah didn't remember the attic hatch being open when she arrived, but the sound of faint movement above her confirmed that someone, or something, was up there. She wanted to run, to get in her car and drive as far from this place as possible, but fear rooted her to the spot. The creaking moved closer to the hatch at the end of the hallway. Hannah's eyes darted to the front door, and she made a decision. Clutching the knife, she unlocked the door and bolted outside into the blizzard. The cold was suffocating, the snow nearly knee-deep, but she didn't stop. She ran to her SUV, fumbling with the keys as the storm raged around her. Finally, she got the door open and climbed inside, locking it behind her. She started the engine and turned on the headlights, illuminating the front of the cabin. Through the snow, she saw the front door swinging open and something stepping out. It wasn't human. The figure was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long and its head cocked at an odd angle. Its movements were jerky, almost insect-like, as it took a step toward the car. Hannah screamed and floored the gas, the tires spinning for a moment before finding traction. She sped down the icy road, glancing in the rearview mirror, only to see the figure standing in the snow, watching her. She didn't stop driving until she reached a small gas station on the edge of town. The clerk gave her a concerned look as she stumbled inside, pale and shaking. She tried to explain what had happened, but the words felt hollow, ridiculous even. Who would believe her? When she returned to the cabin with her father 2 days later, it was eerily quiet. The snow around the cabin was untouched, as though no one had been there. But when they opened the front door, they found deep scratches etched into the wood, scratches that hadn't been there before. Hannah never went back to the cabin, and her family eventually sold it. She couldn't explain what she had seen or heard that night, but she knew one thing for certain. Something was out there, lurking in the winter woods, waiting for the next person foolish enough to be alone. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The winter storm was relentless, the kind that turned the landscape into a sheet of white and made even the most familiar places feel alien. Amelia hadn't planned to drive up to her parents' old cabin that evening, but her boss had pushed her to finish a report, and by the time she had left the city, it was already dusk. The drive was long, winding, and treacherous, the narrow road almost indistinguishable beneath the heavy snow. The cabin sat deep in the woods, far from the nearest neighbor. Amelia's parents had bought it as a summer retreat when she was a child, but after her father's passing 2 years ago, it had been left unused. Her mother refused to set foot there again, but Amelia thought it might be a good place to clear her head. She needed solitude, and the cabin had always felt like a sanctuary, until tonight. When she finally pulled into the driveway, the wind howled through the trees, and the cabin's outline was barely visible through the thick snow. The old structure seemed smaller than she remembered, its steep roof covered in a heavy layer of white. She parked, turned off the engine, and stepped into the biting cold, her boots sinking into the snow with each step. Inside, the cabin was exactly as she had left it during her last visit in the fall. The air was stale, and the temperature inside wasn't much warmer than outside. She turned on the heater and lit a fire in the stone fireplace, watching as the flames began to crackle. The warmth was comforting, but the shadows it cast on the walls seemed to dance too erratically, almost as if alive. Amelia unpacked her things and made herself some tea, trying to settle in. The storm outside was deafening, the wind screaming through the trees and rattling the windows. The isolation felt heavier than she anticipated, and she found herself glancing at the darkened corners of the room more often than she cared to admit. Around 10 p.m., just as she was about to head to bed, she heard it. A faint knock at the door. At first, she thought it might be the wind, but the sound was too deliberate. 3 sharp knocks, followed by silence. Her stomach tightened. She stood frozen for a moment, listening. Another knock came, louder this time. The cabin was miles from the nearest house, and no one knew she was there. Grabbing the fire poker from the hearth, she approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling slightly. There was no response, only the wind howling outside. She unlocked the door and opened it just a crack. The icy air hit her immediately, making her gasp. She shone her flashlight across the porch and into the yard. Nothing. The snow was undisturbed, the storm covering any sign of footprints or tracks. She shut the door quickly, locking it and double-checking the windows. It was probably just her imagination, she told herself. The wind playing tricks on her. But as the night wore on, the sounds continued. A soft tapping at the windows, footsteps crunching in the snow just outside. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest. Every time she looked, there was nothing there. No tracks, no sign that anyone or anything had been near the cabin. She tried to ignore it and went to bed, pulling the covers tightly around herself. The fire in the living room had died down, leaving the cabin in near total darkness. She was just beginning to drift off when she heard it again. This time, the sound of something heavy being dragged across the porch. Amelia bolted upright, her breath coming in short gasps. She grabbed her flashlight and crept toward the window, peeking out through the frost-covered glass. At first, she saw nothing but snow and darkness. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. A shadowy figure standing at the edge of the woods, barely visible in the dim moonlight. The figure didn't move, didn't react to the beam of her flashlight. It simply stood there, watching. A chill ran down her spine. She closed the curtains and backed away from the window, her mind racing. Who would be out here in the middle of a blizzard? She tried calling for help, but her phone had no signal. The storm had knocked out the service, leaving her completely cut off. The rational part of her mind told her to stay calm, but her instincts were screaming at her to leave. As she debated her next move, the knocking resumed. Louder, more insistent. It wasn't coming from the front door this time, but from the back, where the old mudroom led to the woodshed. Amelia grabbed the fire poker again and made her way toward the noise, every step feeling heavier than the last. She reached the mudroom and hesitated. The door was locked, but the knocking continued, rhythmic and almost deliberate. Summoning all her courage, she flung the door open and shone her flashlight into the dark. Once again, there was nothing. The snow outside was untouched, no sign of anyone having been there. But as she turned to close the door, she noticed something strange. On the wooden floor of the mudroom, just inside the doorway, was a single wet footprint, bare, human, and impossibly large. Her blood ran cold. She slammed the door shut, locking it and barricading it with a chair. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew she couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. She grabbed her coat, keys, and phone and bolted outside to her car. The snow was falling so heavily she could barely see a few feet in front of her. She climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind her. The engine roared to life and she turned on the headlights. That's when she saw them. Dozens of figures stood in the snow just beyond the reach of the headlights. They were motionless, their forms indistinct but humanoid. Their heads were tilted as if they were watching her, waiting. Amelia's hands shook as she shifted the car into reverse, the tires spinning for a moment before gaining traction. She backed out of the driveway, her eyes never leaving the figures. They didn't move, didn't follow. They just stood there, silent and still, as she sped down the icy road. She didn't stop driving until she reached the nearest town, where she pulled into a gas station and broke down in tears. The clerk tried to comfort her, but she couldn't find the words to explain what had happened. When she finally returned to the cabin with her brother the next day, the storm had passed and everything seemed normal. The snow around the cabin was untouched and there were no signs of anyone or anything having been there. But Amelia knew what she had seen. The wet footprint in the mudroom, the shadowy figure at the edge of the woods, the silent watchers in the snow, they weren't figments of her imagination. Something had been there that night, something that didn't belong in this world. She never went back to the cabin after that. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The storm had come out of nowhere, a furious blizzard that swallowed the world in white. The forecast had mentioned snow, but nothing like this. Nathan hadn't planned to spend the night at the old lodge, but driving home through the winding mountain roads was no longer an option. The lodge had once been a retreat for his late uncle, and though it was rarely used these days, it still stood sturdy against the elements. He parked his truck just outside the building, the headlights barely piercing the wall of snow. The lodge loomed dark and silent, its silhouette stark against the swirling flakes. Nathan grabbed his duffel bag and hurried inside, slamming the heavy wooden door shut against the biting wind. Inside, the air was frigid and stale. He flipped the switch by the door, and dim lights flickered to life, casting long shadows across the walls. The lodge was rustic but cozy, its furniture covered in sheets to protect against dust. A large stone fireplace dominated the living room, and Nathan quickly set about lighting a fire. The warmth spread slowly, pushing back the chill that seemed to seep from the very walls. By the time the fire was roaring, darkness had fallen, and the storm outside had intensified. Nathan made himself a quick meal and settled into one of the old armchairs by the fire, his phone in hand. The signal was weak, but he managed to send a quick text to his sister, letting her know he was safe. As the hours passed, the lodge grew quieter, the sounds of the storm muffled by its thick walls. Nathan began to relax, his initial unease giving way to the comforting crackle of the fire. But just as he started to doze off, a noise jolted him awake. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind, a distant thudding, like something heavy striking the side of the lodge. Nathan frowned, sitting up straighter. He listened, his heart beating faster as the sound came again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, this time at the front door. He stood, his pulse quickening. Who would be out here in the middle of a blizzard? Grabbing a flashlight from the side table, he approached the door cautiously. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing in the silence. There was no answer, just the relentless howling of the wind. He hesitated, then unlocked the door and cracked it open, peering outside. The beam of his flashlight cut through the snow, revealing an empty porch. There were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. Nathan shut the door, locking it tightly. It was probably just the wind, he told himself. Old buildings like this made all sorts of noises. He tried to shake off the feeling of unease and return to his chair, but the moment he sat down, the knocking came again, this time louder, more forceful. His stomach churned. He didn't want to check the door again, but ignoring it felt impossible. He grabbed a fire poker and approached the door once more, his hands trembling. He flung it open, the cold air hitting him like a wall. Again, there was nothing. But this time, as he scanned the porch with his flashlight, something caught his eye. In the snow, just beyond the porch steps, were footprints, barefoot, human, and leading away into the woods. Nathan's breath caught in his throat. The prints were fresh, the edges sharp despite the falling snow. They disappeared into the dark forest where the trees swayed violently in the storm. He stepped back inside and bolted the door, his heart racing. He couldn't explain what he had just seen, but every instinct screamed at him to stay inside. He tried to distract himself, turning up the volume on his phone's music app and focusing on the fire. But the unease wouldn't leave him. He kept glancing toward the windows, half expecting to see a face staring back at him. Around midnight, the power flickered and went out. The lodge plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the dying fire. Nathan cursed under his breath, fumbling for his flashlight. As he clicked it on, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. The sound made his blood run cold. It was as if something heavy had fallen or been thrown onto the floor above him. He froze, listening intently. The The silence that followed was suffocating, but then came another noise, slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the floorboards above his head. Nathan's grip on the fire poker tightened. He knew he was alone. No one else had the keys to the lodge. Summoning his courage, he moved toward the staircase, the flashlight beam shaking as it illuminated the steps. "Is someone there?" he called, his voice barely above a whisper. No response, just the creaking of the floorboards above. He climbed the stairs slowly, had each step feeling heavier than the last. The hallway at the top was dark, the doors to the bedrooms all slightly ajar. The footsteps had stopped, but the oppressive silence felt worse. Nathan pushed open the first door, his flashlight sweeping across the room. Nothing. The bed was covered in a sheet, untouched. He checked the next room and the next, finding them all empty. But when he reached the last room, the master bedroom, he stopped in his tracks. The bed was uncovered, the sheet pulled back as if someone had just risen from it, and in the middle of the floor was a single wet footprint, stark against the wooden boards. A chill ran down his spine. He backed out of the room, his flashlight shaking. The sound of footsteps resumed, this time coming from downstairs. He turned and bolted down the stairs, his fear overriding his caution. The living room was empty, but the front door was wide open, snow blowing in and melting on the floor. Nathan slammed it shut, locking it again, and leaned against it, his chest heaving. That's when he saw it. Standing at the edge of the woods, just visible through the window, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. The snow obscured its features, but its eyes, black and gleaming, seemed to cut through the storm, locking onto him. Nathan didn't wait to see what it would do. He grabbed his keys and ran to his truck, not caring about the storm or the icy road. The engine roared to life, and he tore out of the driveway, glancing back only once. The figure was still there, standing in the snow, watching as he drove away. Nathan never returned to the lodge, and his family sold the property soon after. He never found an explanation for what happened that night, but the memory of those footprints and the figure in the woods haunted him for years. Whatever it was, it had been waiting for him. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The snowstorm had started unexpectedly, blanketing the small town of Stillwater in an unrelenting wave of white. Sarah had been on her way back from her grandmother's house, a simple visit to deliver groceries, when the storm began to worsen. The roads were nearly invisible, and her car skidded as she fought to keep control. It was foolish to have waited so late, but she had underestimated the storm's ferocity. The narrow, winding road was barely illuminated by her headlights, and when she saw the faint outline of a small sign for the Frost Hollow Inn, she breathed a sigh of relief. She remembered the place from years ago, a historic lodge that her parents had once mentioned during their winter trips. She turned into the driveway, her tires crunching through the thick snow. The building was old, its wooden beams darkened with age. Frost covered the windows, and a single light flickered faintly from inside. Sarah parked and hurried to the front door, her boots sinking deep into the snow. She knocked, the sound muffled by the wind, and waited. After a moment, the door creaked open, revealing a tall, thin man with gray hair and a tired expression. "You're caught in the storm, aren't you?" he asked, his voice low but kind. Sarah nodded. "I couldn't keep driving. Is it all right if I stay here for the night?" The man hesitated, glancing over his shoulder into the dimly lit interior. "We don't get many visitors these days. But yes, of course. Come in." She stepped inside, grateful for the warmth. The inn smelled of wood smoke and something faintly metallic, though she couldn't place it. The lobby was small, with worn furniture and an old desk behind which the man now stood, searching for a key. "I'm Henry, by the way," he said. "I run this place. It's been quiet for some time." "Thank you, Henry." Sarah replied, "I'm Sarah. I really appreciate this." He handed her a brass key attached to a leather tag with the number 4 etched into it. "Your room's upstairs, second on the left. I'll have the generator running soon, so the heat should kick in shortly. For now, there are extra blankets in the room." She thanked him again and climbed the creaking staircase. The inn's age was evident in every detail. The faded wallpaper, the uneven floorboards, the dim sconces that flickered with the slightest draft. Room 4 was small but clean, with a heavy quilt on the bed and a single window overlooking the snow-covered forest. Sarah settled in, removing her boots and jacket. She checked her phone, but there was no signal. Typical for a storm this bad, she thought. She texted her mother anyway, hoping it might go through when the storm let up. The room was cold, but the quilt was thick, and she soon found herself drifting off to the sound of the wind howling outside. Sometime in the night, she awoke abruptly. At first, she didn't know why. The room was silent, except for the faint creak of the old building settling. But then she noticed it. The air felt colder than before, almost unnaturally so. She glanced toward the window and froze. There was someone standing outside. The figure was barely visible through the frost-covered glass, but it was there, tall and unmoving, its face obscured by the snow swirling outside. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. How could anyone be out there in this weather? She sat up, her heart pounding, and approached the window cautiously. When she got closer, she realized something was wrong. The figure wasn't standing on the ground. It was hovering just above it. Its head was tilted unnaturally, and its dark eyes seemed to fix directly on her despite the swirling snow. Sarah stumbled back, nearly tripping over her bag. She turned on the bedside lamp, but when she looked back at the window, the figure was gone. Only the snow remained, thick and untouched. She tried to convince herself it had been a trick of the light, her tired mind playing tricks on her. But sleep didn't come easily after that. The next morning, the storm had calmed, though the world outside was still buried in snow. Sarah went downstairs, hoping to grab a quick breakfast and leave. The lobby was empty, and there was no sign of Henry. She called out for him, but received no response. Curious, she stepped behind the desk, her fingers brushing over an old guest book. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but when she flipped to the last entries, her blood ran cold. The most recent entry was dated over 20 years ago. Confused and uneasy, Sarah returned to her room to gather her things. As she passed the window, she stopped, her breath catching. In the snow outside, directly beneath her window, were footprints, bare, human, and leading away into the woods. Panic set in. She grabbed her bag and headed for the door, intent on leaving immediately. But as she reached the bottom of the stairs, she heard something that stopped her dead in her tracks. A soft, deliberate knock coming from the back door of the inn. She turned slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but the swirling snow. But before she could move, a whisper echoed through the empty hall, so faint she almost didn't hear it. Leave, while you can. She didn't need to be told twice. Sarah bolted for the front door, throwing it open and running to her car. She didn't care about the snow or the icy roads. She started the engine and sped down the driveway, glancing in her rearview mirror only once. The inn stood silent against the white landscape, but she could swear she saw a figure in the upstairs window, watching her leave. When Sarah reached the main road, she finally allowed herself to breathe. She stopped at a small gas station in the next town to collect her thoughts and warm up. The clerk, an older woman with kind eyes, noticed her shaken state and asked if she was all right. Sarah hesitated, then asked, "Do you know anything about the Frost Hollow Inn?" The woman's face darkened. "That place? It's been abandoned for years. Closed down after a fire in the late 90s. They say the owner, Henry, I think his name was, never left, though." Sarah's hands trembled as she held her coffee. "Never left?" The woman nodded. "People around here say his spirit's still there, keeping watch. And sometimes on nights like last night, when the storm's at its worst, you can see the others, the ones who never made it out." Sarah didn't respond. She left the gas station and drove home, vowing never to take that road again. Story the end.